Hello, hello. You're listening to the Bitcoin Advocate podcast. I'm your host, Andy. And if you're new here, welcome. This is a show where we discuss all things Bitcoin on a weekly basis. This is a show that I wish I had when I first got into Bitcoin, which is why I started this podcast. This is your one-stop shop of complex topics in the wonderful world of Bitcoin, explained in simple ways. As a reminder, this show is available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, and a whole bunch of other platforms. So wherever you might be listening from, if you like the show, be sure to follow and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/thebtcadvocate. Today's episode is sponsored by myself. Specifically, I have a book about Bitcoin called Hyper-Bitcoinization, A Story About a Revolution. And if you're watching this on YouTube, there's a link down below to that book in the description. Otherwise, you can search for the title on Amazon and it should be one of the first results. It's not selling out if it's my own product. Last week, we wrapped up our 2-episode mini-series on addressing the criticisms surrounding Bitcoin. We covered topics such as addressing the energy usage criticism, among many others, so be sure to check out those episodes if you haven't already. This week, we're discussing the central bank digital currency and the potential for the government in the future to use this technology for nefarious purposes, and what we can do to help protect our freedom and ensure that we maintain a just and equitable society. So first, as always, it's important to define our topics. So let's first talk about what a central bank digital currency is. Central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs for short, as defined by the famous consulting firm McKinsey, are a digital form of government-issued currency that isn't pegged to a physical commodity. They're issued by central banks, whose role is to support financial services for a nation's government and its commercial banking system, setting monetary policy and issuing currency. Further, the technology that enables CBDCs might be similar to blockchain technologies that already exist in the cryptocurrency world. However, this is where I'll insert my own opinion, which is that the difference between a CBDC and a cryptocurrency is that rather than having a series of decentralized nodes controlling the ledger, all the nodes controlling a CBDC would be under the direct control of the central bank, who is also, again, the issuer of the currency. So, in simpler words, the CBDC would be a digital form of fiat that is fully centralized and controlled by the government. So at this point, you might be thinking, hey, what's the big deal? My money's already digital anyways because I keep it in a bank and I never use cash anymore. While that might be true, a CBDC is still on a whole different level of digitalization and centralization. So if you ever try to link two bank accounts together at two different banks, you'll notice that this process isn't exactly always the smoothest. And also, you'll notice that the financial services that you access and rely on today also rely on a series of different companies. So, for example, you might primarily bank with JP Morgan Chase, let's say, but you have another bank account at Wells Fargo. When you buy something, you might use the Visa network on your credit card. When you send someone money in a different country, you might be using Western Union. And this is not counting all the back-end services that each of these companies use to integrate everything together so you as the customer don't have to deal with that and you never see as the customer. So although I wouldn't call this decentralized like the way that Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies are, this is at least not as centralized as a CBDC would be. A CBDC would involve a direct relationship between you as the individual and a country's central bank. So this means that eventually you may be required to keep all your money in a government-controlled account, and whenever you spend the money or transact with anyone, the payment rails would also be controlled by the central bank. The government would be able to see and track every transaction and retain the ability to approve or deny each of your transactions. So for instance, the government may decide that you've bought too much alcohol this week, so they limit the amount of money you can buy on alcohol for the rest of the week. Your transaction will just get denied if you go over that limit. Or it could be cigarettes or lottery tickets or, whatever. But whatever the government thinks that you shouldn't be buying, they can just deny you. If you're caught speeding, they can also just take the fine right out of your account because remember, they fully control the account. Or if you get on the government's naughty list, they can just lock you out of the ability to transact with anyone for anything altogether. So you see the difference here. Although you may keep your money in a bank account, and the bank can still lock you out if they think you've done something wrong, this ability to deny someone financial access would not be instant nor universal like the way that it would be with the CBDC. If one bank locks you out, you can probably just go to another bank or a small credit union. Even if the government decides to issue a blanket order to freeze all your bank accounts, the effects would not be instant, as it may take a few business days for all the companies you have relationships with to find you and lock you out. But with CBDCs, though, the government can just flip a switch and lock you out of everything instantly. And I know whenever I touch upon issues that are even slightly political in nature, I always get a few people saying, well, then just don't break the law, right? Just don't get on the government's bad side and they won't lock you out. Well, to the proponents of this argument, I find that they're pretty much exclusively people from Western democratic countries who have never traveled to or interacted with people from less democratic countries like Russia or China or parts of the Middle East. You try going to those countries and simply telling people, hey, just don't break the law. That's like telling someone who is depressed, hey, just don't be sad. It's like, wow, why didn't I think of that, right? Problem solved. What you have to understand is that even in Western democratic countries, the government is not free from the potential of the abuse of power and corruption of the government. In February of 2022, a group of Canadian freight transport truckers decided to start a convoy across southern Ontario and parts of Alberta in a semi-organized protest against the mask and vaccine mandates imposed by the Canadian federal government as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate about masks and vaccines. I'll leave that debate for other people. But regardless of whether you think the trucker protests were justified or not, one of the measures the federal Canadian government decided to do was freeze the bank accounts of the people who were involved with, or potentially even just people who had donated to the truckers and protest organizers. Now, I'm of the belief that most people are reasonable. And even if you're of the belief that the truckers' cause was dumb, I think that you'll at least find some merit in my next point, which is that, in effect, the government has started a dangerous precedent by using the financial system as a weapon to counter political dissidents. The truckers, like it or not, had a political opinion. They didn't want vaccine or mask mandates. That went against what the government wanted, so the truckers went to protest. And in turn, the government, in an effort to try and break up the protests, used the financial system as a tool. Now, the proponents will say, well, the truckers were blocking roads and making a lot of noise and disrupting the peace. Well, let me put it this way. If it was a protest about climate change, and there have been protests about climate change where the protesters have blocked roads and made a lot of noise, would the government have acted the same way? By the way, politically, I consider myself to be in the middle, so I'm neither left nor right wing. I see merit from both sides. So I hope I'm coming off as at least somewhat objective here. But what I'm seeing is that the current Canadian government, headed by the Liberals, which are a left-leaning party, saw that there was a right-wing protest, i.e. the truckers, and decided to weaponize the financial system to crack down on people that disagreed with the government. Whereas if it was a protest about climate change, which is generally considered more of an issue on the left wing, well, the government doesn't try to shut it down or freeze anyone's bank accounts. And really, I am not trying to be political here. I'm really just trying to get you to see the downsides of the government using the financial system to quash protests. And I think that this is something that we should push back on, no matter if you're left or right-winged. If we allowed a left-wing government to weaponize the financial system against right-winged people, i.e. the truckers, then what if one day a right-wing government gets in charge and uses the financial system against the climate change activists, right? Against left-wing people. So be careful when you cheer on the government flexing their muscles, even if it's on a group of people that you disagree with, because it could easily one day be turned back against you. And we're coming up to a crossroads in point in time where the governments around the world are piloting their CBDC projects, like China and Nigeria, who have already a semi-working solution in place, and countries in Europe, as well as Canada and the US, are actively developing a CBDC already. And besides the obvious, which is more control and ability to tackle political dissidents, why else would governments around the world want to implement a CBDC? Well, another reason is to keep the fiat system going. So we're living in a time where essentially all developed Western nations are running massive budget deficits, as in we're spending more money than the tax revenue that's coming in. And I explained in earlier episodes why raising taxes is problematic, because you can only raise taxes so much on the rich before they leave your country or find ways to hide the money. And at the rates that the governments of the US, Canada, and the Western countries are spending, even if you tax the rich heavily, that's still not enough money, and you'll end up having to tax the middle class, which is politically untenable. So without the ability to pay for spending with tax increases, your only option is to print money. When you print money, that causes inflation. To tackle inflation, the central bank needs to raise interest rates, but raising interest rates causes another problem. When the interest rate goes too high, that increases the amount of money the government needs to pay to service their own debts. So if the government is increasing the interest rates that they themselves have to pay, eventually that number becomes so huge that it becomes a problem in of itself. So the next natural step would be for the government to find a way to bring the interest rate back down so that they can get some relief on the interest that they have to pay on their existing debt. Sure, this will cause inflation to continue to be a problem, but as long as the economy is growing, this won't cause immediate problems, and you can kick the can down the road a little bit more. So we've seen this in Latin America, Southeast Asia, parts of the Middle East, who have experienced double-digit inflation. And sure, their economies aren't doing fantastic, but their countries have not immediately collapsed. Here in the Western world, you see people complaining about 6% inflation like it's the end of the world. But the truth is, even if it was double or triple that, it would suck. I'm not denying that, but it wouldn't be enough to bring down the entire country, at least not immediately. But the premise is that as long as the economy itself is growing, it is possible to stomach a higher inflation rate. So the natural next step for the government would be to give up on keeping inflation low, but instead focus on stimulating the economy, which they can do by lowering interest rates. And with the help of a CBDC, they can eventually eliminate cash and take interest rates to the negatives. So think about this for a moment. If you earn a negative interest rate on your money on a bank account, meaning that you actually had to pay the bank a portion of your deposits every month or every year, you'll probably be like, screw that, I'm taking all my money out and stuffing it under my mattress. But what if there was no more cash? So to prevent you from taking the money out of the system, and the fact that cash transactions the government cannot track, the first goal of the CBDC is to eliminate cash. And if you think, oh, that's such a crazy idea, that can't happen, well, think again. In 2016, the government of India announced that the 1,000 rupee banknote was no longer legal tender. So overnight, the government of India announced that if you had a certain banknote, it becomes worthless after a certain date. So you better go and deposit the money in a bank account or exchange it for other banknotes because otherwise it becomes worthless. And they can do that because it is a fiat currency, and the value of fiat is what the government says it is. So although they didn't announce that all cash would be obsolete, trust me, if the Indian government's technology infrastructure was advanced enough, they would have preferred to just do that instead and eliminate all cash. The limiting factor in 2016 was the technology infrastructure, not a lack of will. But technology improves, and this might change in 2026 instead of 2016. Who knows? So the reason, again, why they want to eliminate cash is that eliminating cash gives the government more control. And once that's done, they can implement the negative interest rates I was talking about. And there's nothing you can do about it at that point because you cannot withdraw your money. And the reason why they want to implement negative interest rates is to encourage you to spend money, therefore stimulating the economy. So if you think about it, if you have to pay the bank to keep your money there instead of getting paid, you might as well just spend your money now instead of just waiting for the bank to take it from you bit by bit. And also, this would help the government's debt crisis since they would now be making money from their borrowed debt instead of having to spend money to service that debt. Further, with a CBDC, besides a negative interest rate, the government would also have the ability to put a time limit on your paycheck. So imagine every time you get paid, you have 30 days to spend it or else the money is gone. And remember, you can't withdraw it because there's no more cash. So essentially, this would outlaw saving money. If you can't even save money and you're forced to spend it, this keeps money velocity extremely high and again stimulates the economy. And in this case, if it wasn't clear by now, all the downside to all of this, imagine never being able to save money, which means that you'll never be able to progress financially. If you're poor now, you'll always be poor. And if you disagree with the government, you'll just get locked out of the financial system as a whole. So you ever seen that episode of Black Mirror where everyone has an implant that allows them to block people in real life? It's like you can press a button and it just turns off your ability to see or hear that person. A CBDC would enable that ability in a financial sense. And granted, I'm not saying that all of these things will necessarily happen, but it's like, how about we don't give the government that power in the first place? It's like if you know a person used to be a serial killer, but they've served time in jail and they got an early release on good behavior, it may still be a good idea to not put a weapon in that person's hands. And unfortunately, maybe I'm just being too cynical, but I think the average person in countries like the US and Canada is just simply not financially educated enough to see any of this coming. And I know you guys are well aware because you're listening to a podcast about Bitcoin, but the average person, the government can just go to them and be like, hey, look at this new technology we invented and look how much better and faster it is than cash. Why not just use this instead? And the average person would just be like, yeah, that sounds about right. Let's use it. And to further speed up the adoption, the government can also run an incentive program. Say if everything you bought with the CBDC was 10% off, then you'd really get a lot of people to use it. And in the beginning, there probably won't be any of those control measures like the negative interest rates or the expiration date on the money or that kind of stuff because they need adoption to hit a critical mass. But once it does, then the incentives like the 10% off will go away and then you'll realize one day that you can't buy cigarettes anymore. And even at that point, you'll have people be like, okay, good, you shouldn't be buying cigarettes or alcohol or gambling related stuff anyways. This is good for society. It's good that the government is stepping in to curb these things. But the crux of the issue is that one day it might not just be restrictions on those things. So yeah, you see the point I'm getting at here? Well, as I said, the way I see it, we're at a crossroads. The only other alternative I see is Bitcoin, which is an open, decentralized, permissionless monetary system. And the permissionless part is very relevant here. Permissionless means that you don't need anyone's permission to transact using Bitcoin. If you send a transaction that is valid, as long as it obeys the rules of the protocol and you paid sufficient network fees to get it picked up by a miner, the transaction is going to go through. There's no other conditions. You don't need permission from a company or a government. And the fact is that I believe that as technology evolves, money is only going to get digitized anyways. So we have to choose between CBDCs and Bitcoin. One of those is going to happen. And for a while, maybe a weird combination of both like we're seeing right now, but one of them is going to win out. But neither winning out is not an option, which means that one of them has to win out. We're not going to stay in the current system and cash will go away at some point. I don't see a scenario where in, let's say, 300 years, we're still going to be using cash. And I think that this battle between Bitcoin and CBDCs is way more important than people realize. When people hear about CBDCs for the first time, they think, oh, it's similar to a cryptocurrency, right? No, it's actually the exact opposite. Bitcoin and CBDCs are two diametrically opposed ideologies. Bitcoin is about freedom and power to the individual, while CBDCs are about centralized government control. And to put my weight behind Bitcoin is why I started this podcast. Question is, which path are you going to choose? Okay, we'll leave it here for this week. Next week, we'll delve back into some of the other details of the technology surrounding Bitcoin, including Bitcoin storage and wallets, and spend some time talking about how Bitcoin wallets work. Thank you for listening. and I'll see you all next week. Bye bye.